What if I told you that a state governor's attempt to ban a congresswoman from his own state would end up destroying his own political career? When Greg Abbott dared to try this, the federal documents in Jasmine Crockett's possession would bury his 15-year governorship within 96 hours. The morning of June 15, 2025, started with what seemed like a routine political controversy in Austin, Texas. Governor Greg Abbott had just signed Executive Order 2025-423, officially banning Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from participating in any voter registration events within the state of Texas. The order cited threats to election integrity and federal interference in state electoral processes. What Abbott didn't know was that this single signature would trigger a constitutional crisis that would end his political career and expose a web of corruption stretching back 16 years. At 6:23 a.m. that morning, Jasmine Crockett was sitting in her Washington, D.C. office, reviewing briefing materials for a House Judiciary Committee hearing scheduled for later that week. Her phone buzzed with a text from her chief of staff. "Abbott just banned you from Texas. Check the news." Within minutes, her office was flooded with calls from reporters, supporters, and fellow members of Congress. But Jasmine wasn't panicking. In fact, she was smiling, because for the past 8 months she had been waiting for Abbott to make exactly this kind of mistake. The story of how we got to this moment began in October 2024, when Jasmine had requested access to federal records related to Texas's use of disaster relief funds following Hurricane Patricia in 2019. What should have been a routine congressional oversight request had been met with unusual resistance from Texas state officials. When Jasmine pressed harder, asking for specific documentation about how $2.7 billion in federal disaster funds had been allocated, the resistance turned into outright obstruction. That obstruction had piqued Jasmine's interest. As a former civil rights attorney with a background in financial forensics, she knew that when politicians fought this hard to keep documents secret, there was usually a very good reason. So she had done what she did best. She had started digging. And what she found in those federal records would have made even the most hardened corruption investigators gasp in disbelief. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that June morning when Abbott signed what he thought would be a decisive blow against federal interference in Texas politics. The executive order was written in bold, uncompromising language. Whereas the state of Texas has sovereign authority over its electoral processes, and whereas certain federal officials have attempted to interfere with legitimate state efforts to ensure election integrity, I hereby order that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is prohibited from participating in, organizing, or attending any voter registration events within the boundaries of the state of Texas. The order was immediately hailed by Abbott's supporters as a bold defense of state rights. Conservative media outlets praised it as exactly the kind of strong leadership America needed. Abbott himself held a press conference at 2 p.m. that afternoon, standing behind a podium adorned with Texas flags, looking every inch the confident politician who had just scored a major victory. "Today, Texas has drawn a line in the sand," Abbott declared to the assembled reporters and supporters. "We will not allow federal politicians to interfere with our constitutional right to conduct fair and secure elections. Congresswoman Crockett has repeatedly attempted to undermine Texas's efforts to ensure election integrity, and this ends now." The press conference was carried live on Fox News, OAN, and several Texas-based news networks. Abbott fielded questions from friendly reporters who praised his decisive action and his commitment to state sovereignty. For 43 minutes, it looked like Abbott had successfully framed the narrative around federal overreach versus state rights. What Abbott didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett was watching the press conference from her office in Washington, and she was taking notes. Detailed notes, because every word Abbott spoke was about to be used against him in ways he couldn't imagine. At exactly 3:17 p.m., 18 minutes after Abbott's press conference ended, Jasmine's office released a statement that sent shockwaves through political Washington. Governor Abbott's executive order is not only unconstitutional, it's also evidence of a cover-up. For the past 8 months, I have been investigating the misuse of federal disaster relief funds in Texas. Governor Abbott's attempt to ban me from the state is a desperate effort to prevent the exposure of criminal conduct that has deprived Texas citizens of billions of dollars in aid they were legally entitled to receive. The statement went on to announce that Jasmine would be holding her own press conference the following morning at 10 a.m., where she would present documented evidence of systematic fraud in the allocation of federal disaster relief funds, evidence that Governor Abbott has been aware of and complicit in for over 6 years. The political media went into overdrive. Cable news shows cleared their schedules. Political reporters began making frantic calls to sources in Texas and Washington. Social media exploded with speculation about what Jasmine might reveal. Abbott cover-up began trending on Twitter within 2 hours. But the real action was happening behind the scenes, in phone calls and encrypted messages between Austin and Washington, between Republican operatives and Texas state officials, between Abbott's office and various federal agencies. Because while the public was focused on the constitutional drama of a governor trying to ban a congresswoman from his state, the real stakes were much higher. At 11:47 p.m. that night, 3 FBI agents arrived at the Houston office of Lone Star Construction Services, the company that had received the largest single allocation of Hurricane Patricia disaster relief funds. They served a federal search warrant and spent the next 7 hours removing boxes of documents, computer hard drives, and financial records. By sunrise, similar raids were being conducted at 4 other Texas companies that had received major disaster relief contracts. The timing wasn't coincidental. Jasmine Crockett had spent 8 months building a case, and Abbott's executive order had given her the perfect opportunity to go public with evidence she had been meticulously gathering through congressional oversight channels. The FBI raids were the result of a federal investigation that had been quietly underway for months, an investigation triggered by Jasmine's initial records requests. At 10 a.m. sharp on June 16, 2025, Jasmine stepped up to a podium in the Rayburn House office building, surrounded by stacks of documents and flanked by 2 attorneys from the Congressional Oversight Office. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and congressional staff. C-SPAN was carrying the press conference live, and every major news network had breaking news banners scrolling across their screens. "Good morning," Jasmine began, her voice calm and professional. "Yesterday, Governor Abbott banned me from the state of Texas, claiming I was interfering with election integrity. Today, I'm going to show you the real reason he wanted to keep me out of Texas. I've uncovered evidence of the largest disaster relief fraud scheme in American history." She gestured to the documents beside her. These are federal records documenting the allocation and use of $2.7 billion in Hurricane Patricia disaster relief funds. What these records show is a systematic pattern of fraud, kickbacks, and misappropriation that has stolen money intended to help hurricane victims and diverted it into the pockets of Governor Abbott's political allies and campaign contributors. The room erupted with questions from reporters, but Jasmine held up her hand. "I'm going to walk you through the evidence systematically, because the American people deserve to understand exactly how their tax dollars were stolen and exactly who was responsible." She picked up the first stack of documents. Let's start with Lone Star Construction Services, owned by Marcus Richardson. Between 2019 and 2024, Lone Star received $347 million in disaster relief contracts. According to federal records, Marcus Richardson has donated $1.2 million to Governor Abbott's campaigns and political action committees over the same time period. She held up a photograph showing Abbott and Richardson shaking hands at what appeared to be a campaign fundraiser. This photograph was taken at Abbott's 2022 re-election kickoff event. The caption in the Austin American-Statesman reads, "Governor Abbott thanks major donor Marcus Richardson for his continued support." Jasmine picked up another document. Here's where it gets interesting. Federal disaster relief contracts are supposed to be awarded through competitive bidding processes with strict oversight. But Lone Star Construction received 73% of their contracts through emergency no-bid provisions that bypassed normal competitive requirements. She looked directly at the cameras. In other words, Governor Abbott's office used emergency provisions to give no-bid contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to his biggest campaign contributor, claiming these contracts were too urgent for normal bidding processes. The reporters were now taking notes frantically. This was clearly much bigger than anyone had expected. Jasmine continued with devastating precision. Now, you might think that even if the bidding process was questionable, at least the work got done and hurricane victims were helped. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. She held up a thick folder filled with photographs. These are pictures of projects that Lone Star Construction was paid to complete. Roads that were never repaired, bridges that were never rebuilt, housing developments that were never constructed. She pulled out one particularly damning photograph showing an empty lot with a sign reading, "Future site of Patricia Heights Emergency Housing, funded by Federal Disaster Relief." The sign was dated 2020, but the photograph was clearly recent, showing nothing but weeds growing around the abandoned sign. Lone Star Construction was paid $47 million to build emergency housing on this site. As you can see, no housing was ever built. But Marcus Richardson's company kept the money, and Governor Abbott's administration never demanded accountability. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just political favoritism. This was outright theft of federal disaster relief funds intended to help hurricane victims. But Jasmine wasn't done. Lone Star Construction is just one example. Let me tell you about Alamo Infrastructure Solutions, owned by Rebecca Santos. Between 2019 and 2024, Alamo received $298 million in disaster relief contracts. Rebecca Santos has donated $890,000 to Abbott's campaigns. And like Lone Star, 68% of Alamo's contracts were no-bid emergency awards. She held up more photographs. These are pictures of roads that Alamo was paid to repair after Hurricane Patricia. The before and after photos show that no work was actually performed, but Alamo was paid in full for road reconstruction that never happened. The scale of the fraud was becoming clear, but the most damaging revelation was yet to come. Jasmine reached for a different stack of documents, these marked with red tabs. Now, you might be wondering how Governor Abbott's administration could allow this kind of fraud to continue for 6 years without taking action. The answer is simple. They were getting paid to look the other way. She held up a bank record. This is a deposit slip from Governor Abbott's personal bank account, dated March 15, 2022. It shows a deposit of $125,000 from something called the Texas Recovery Foundation. Another document. This is the incorporation paperwork for the Texas Recovery Foundation. It was established in 2019, immediately after Hurricane Patricia. Its sole funding source was kickbacks from companies receiving disaster relief contracts. Its sole purpose was making payments to Texas state officials who ensured those companies received continued contracts without oversight. The room was now completely silent, except for the sound of cameras clicking and reporters typing. This wasn't just fraud. This was organized corruption involving the highest levels of Texas state government. Between 2019 and 2023, Governor Abbott received $847,000 in payments from the Texas Recovery Foundation. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick received $423,000. Attorney General Ken Paxton received $312,000. These weren't campaign contributions, which would have been legal and publicly reported. These were direct personal payments in exchange for ensuring that disaster relief contracts continued flowing to companies that were stealing federal funds. Jasmine paused to let the implications sink in. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why Governor Abbott tried to ban me from Texas yesterday. This is why his administration fought so hard to prevent congressional oversight of disaster relief spending. This is why they used election integrity as a pretext to try to keep me from investigating what they knew was criminal conduct. She picked up one final document. This is an email dated May 28, 2025, just 2 weeks ago, from Abbott's Chief of Staff to the Attorney General's office. The subject line reads, "Crockett problem escalating." The email discusses strategies for neutralizing federal oversight and limiting congressional access to sensitive records. The email excerpt she read was devastating. "We need to find a way to keep Crockett out of Texas permanently. Her records requests are getting too close to the Richardson contracts and the foundation payments. Legal suggests we could use election integrity concerns as justification for limiting her access to state facilities." The press conference had been going on for 47 minutes, and Jasmine had systematically dismantled not just Governor Abbott's justification for banning her from Texas, but his entire administration's credibility. The evidence she presented wasn't speculation or political rhetoric. It was documented proof of organized corruption involving hundreds of millions of federal dollars. "In conclusion," Jasmine said, "Governor Abbott's executive order banning me from Texas wasn't about election integrity or state rights. It was about covering up criminal conduct. It was about preventing accountability for the theft of disaster relief funds that were supposed to help hurricane victims rebuild their lives." She gestured to the documents surrounding her. "All of this evidence has been turned over to federal law enforcement. The FBI raids you saw last night were just the beginning. This investigation will continue until every stolen dollar is recovered and every corrupt official is held accountable." The questions from reporters came in a flood. "Congresswoman, are you calling for Governor Abbott's resignation? What's your response to claims that this is a partisan witch hunt? How did you obtain these financial records? Will you be seeking federal charges against Texas officials?" Jasmine answered each question with the same methodical precision she had used throughout the press conference. She explained that the financial records had been obtained through legal congressional oversight processes. She noted that corruption wasn't a partisan issue, it was a criminal issue. She said that decisions about resignation were up to the people of Texas and their elected representatives. But the most telling moment came when a reporter asked, "Congresswoman, Governor Abbott's office has issued a statement calling this a desperate attempt to distract from federal overreach. How do you respond?" Jasmine smiled slightly. "I'd respond with this. Governor Abbott received $847,000 in kickbacks from companies that stole disaster relief money intended for hurricane victims. That's not federal overreach. That's documented criminal conduct. And no executive order, no matter how bold it sounds, can make that evidence disappear." Within 6 hours of Jasmine's press conference, the political landscape had completely changed. Texas Democrats were calling for Abbott's immediate resignation. Several Texas Republicans were distancing themselves from the governor and calling for investigations. National Republican leaders were notably silent, clearly trying to figure out how to respond to evidence that seemed impossible to refute. By that evening, 3 more companies that had received major disaster relief contracts had been raided by federal agents. The Texas Attorney General's office had been served with federal subpoenas. Bank records for the Texas Recovery Foundation had been frozen pending investigation, and Governor Abbott had canceled all public appearances for the rest of the week. The executive order banning Jasmine Crockett from Texas was quietly rescinded at 11:47 p.m. that night, buried in a brief press release that claimed the order had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. But the damage was done. Abbott's attempt to silence congressional oversight had instead triggered the exposure of the largest state-level corruption scandal in modern American history. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded far beyond the original disaster relief contracts. Federal investigators discovered that the kickback scheme had been used to funnel money from other federal programs as well. Education grants, infrastructure funding, and health care subsidies had all been manipulated to benefit Abbott's political allies in exchange for personal payments to state officials. The scope of the corruption was staggering. By July 2025, federal investigators had identified over $1.2 billion in misappropriated federal funds, involving 17 different companies and 34 Texas state officials. What had started as Jasmine's investigation into Hurricane Patricia relief had uncovered a systematic pattern of corruption that had been operating for nearly a decade. Governor Abbott's approval ratings, which had been at 54% before his executive order, plummeted to 23% within 3 weeks. Calls for his impeachment came not just from Democrats, but from several prominent Texas Republicans who felt betrayed by revelations about the kickback scheme. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Attorney General Ken Paxton both resigned from their positions rather than face federal corruption charges. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the constitutional precedent that emerged from Abbott's failed attempt to ban a federal congresswoman from his state. Legal scholars across the political spectrum condemned the executive order as an unprecedented attack on the separation of powers and congressional authority. The incident became a case study in how state officials who attempted to obstruct federal oversight could end up destroying themselves in the process. 3 months later, when federal prosecutors announced that Governor Abbott, Marcus Richardson, Rebecca Santos, and 14 other defendants would face federal corruption charges, Jasmine Crockett was asked by reporters how she felt about the vindication of her investigation. "Val, this was never about vindication," she replied. "This was about accountability. Hurricane Patricia victims deserved better than having their disaster relief money stolen by corrupt officials. Texas taxpayers deserved better than having their government sold to the highest bidder. And the American people deserve to know that federal oversight of state spending actually works when Congress does its job." She paused, then added, "Governor Abbott thought he could silence congressional oversight with an executive order. What he actually did was provide the evidence we needed to prove that oversight was necessary. Sometimes the cover-up really is worse than the crime." The trials that followed would captivate the nation for months. Governor Abbott's defense team argued that he had been misled by subordinates and hadn't known about the kickback scheme. But Jasmine's meticulous documentation, including emails, bank records, and recorded phone calls, painted a picture of a governor who hadn't just known about the corruption, but had actively participated in organizing it. Marcus Richardson, facing 47 federal charges, eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony revealed that the kickback scheme had been Abbott's idea from the beginning, designed to create a reliable source of off-the-books income that wouldn't be subject to campaign finance reporting requirements. Rebecca Santos's testimony was even more damaging. She described meetings at the governor's mansion where Abbott had personally negotiated the terms of kickback payments, discussing what percentage of contract values would be paid into the Texas Recovery Foundation and how those payments would be distributed among various state officials. The evidence was so overwhelming that Abbott's attorneys eventually advised him to negotiate a plea agreement rather than face trial. In August 2025, Greg Abbott pleaded guilty to federal corruption charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His resignation from the governorship was immediate, ending a political career that had spanned over 2 decades. But the most lasting impact of what became known as the Texas disaster scandal wasn't the individual prosecutions or even the recovery of stolen funds. It was the fundamental change in how federal oversight of state spending was conducted. Congress passed new legislation requiring real-time federal monitoring of disaster relief contracts, eliminating the emergency provisions that had allowed the no-bid contracts that made the fraud possible. More importantly, the scandal demonstrated that congressional oversight, when conducted with sufficient preparation and documentation, could be devastatingly effective. Jasmine Crockett's methodical approach, gathering evidence for months before going public, building an airtight case before making accusations, and timing the revelation for maximum impact, became a model for how legislative oversight should be conducted. The attempted ban that was supposed to silence her had instead amplified her voice and provided the perfect platform for exposing corruption. Abbott's executive order had backfired so spectacularly that political scientists would study it for decades as an example of how attempts to obstruct oversight could actually strengthen it. 1 year later, when Jasmine Crockett was asked to speak at a conference on congressional oversight, she reflected on the lessons learned from the Texas investigation. Corruption thrives in darkness, and oversight dies when it's not backed up by solid evidence. Governor Abbott thought he could keep his corruption hidden by keeping congressional investigators out of Texas. What he actually did was provide us with evidence that his administration had something to hide. The executive order wasn't just unconstitutional, it was also a confession. It told us that our investigation was on the right track and that we needed to dig deeper. In the end, Abbott's attempt to ban me from Texas was the best thing that could have happened for our investigation. It gave us the publicity and political support we needed to expose the full scope of the corruption. The yellow folder that had contained evidence of Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's intellectual dishonesty had been replaced by boxes of documents proving Governor Abbott's criminal conduct. But the principle was the same. When politicians tried to escape accountability through obstruction and intimidation, they often ended up providing the very evidence needed to hold them accountable. And so the woman who had been banned from Texas for supposedly interfering with election integrity had instead exposed a corruption scheme that had stolen over $1 billion from hurricane victims. The governor who had tried to silence federal oversight had ended up facing federal prison time, and the state that had claimed sovereignty over its own affairs had learned that some affairs were too important to be left to state officials alone. The Texas disaster scandal would be remembered as a watershed moment in American politics, when congressional oversight proved it could still hold corrupt officials accountable, when federal law enforcement showed it could still investigate and prosecute organized corruption, and when one Congresswoman with a stack of documents proved that sometimes the best response to attempted intimidation is simply telling the truth. As Jasmine Crockett had said in that press conference that changed everything, no executive order, no matter how bold it sounds, can make evidence disappear. Governor Greg Abbott had learned that lesson the hard way, and American democracy was stronger because of it.